My name is Kendra Mills, and I'm reading A Craving for Sistering. A country in recovery, we possess a craving for the pulse, the animal irony, the rifle crescendo before Thanksgiving. For a hunter's degenerate theater, the bleeding is external, the epicenter fades from view. Sistering may yet be the antithesis to the bloodbath of November. That, I think, is the hardest question of the ones that you sent over. But for me, it's sort of the most instinctive form of creative expression. And I grew up in a very artistic tradition. All the schooling that I had a pretty heavy focus on arts. And the thing that I connected to most was creative writing. I always wrote stories as a child. And then it sort of adapted as I became an adult. And I found poetry to be, like I said, the most instinctive. And in a lot of ways, I write poetry in sort of a journalistic sense instead of like bullet journaling and just keeping it for myself. I try to shape it into something that has like a coherent element to it to a certain extent. But I think there's a lot in my poetry that is not exactly linear. And I think that's one of the beauties of the form is that it doesn't have to be, not that fiction necessarily has to be, or even creative nonfiction. But I find poetry particularly freeing in that regard. Yes, so the first two are kind of interrelated. I wrote them last spring when I was living in France at the time, and I was leaving to come back to the United States, and I was in a relationship that I was sort of processing in this sense in my creative life. So the first poem, Reciprocity, was about a vacation that we went on to his family's house on the coast of France, and there was this seawall like between his house and the sea, and it was covered in the most snails I had ever seen in my life. So I like noted that down that day, and then I came back to it, which is a lot of how I write, which I think we'll get to later. So I like made that observation, and then this poem grew out of that. And then another interesting thing was that he had read this book, which the title escapes me. I should have looked it up before this point, but it was a horror graphic novel about spirals. And he and I had been talking about that, and then when we saw the snails, it like sprang to mind again. And then the second poem, I was really just, again, like thoughts that I was having. So it doesn't have like a particular point. I think it just captures to a certain extent a little bit how I was feeling. And I wrote it on June 21st, which is why it was called Solstice. So it is more just like a snapshot of my life in that moment. And then the final one is actually the oldest poem that is included in these three that I wrote in the fall of 2020 around Thanksgiving. I'm from a really small rural town in Massachusetts, and I had just moved home sort of as a result of COVID, and was sort of grappling with a lot of aspects of being in that small rural town, the hunting community. So this was based on an observation that I made when I was running in the woods during hunting season. And then again, I came back to it, to the note that I had made, and wrote a poem about it. Yes, so I don't think it will surprise you that my tip would be, at least what works for me, is to keep observations of things that are really meaningful to you. And I have some in books and some on my phone, because sometimes I like see or realize something that I don't have the time to actually like write down. And how I do it is I don't do it as a practice. I know some people who keep like a really like dedicated and rigorous journaling practice where they do it every morning or every night. And I have found that can be really stifling for me. So instead I try to do it just as the impulse strikes. And then usually I'll take a couple of those notes and I will be inspired to build a poem around them, or maybe just one note. Or I'll realize that it like fits in with like some previously written work. But I would say that to like, I also write like there are people I think who can write about like big political moments, or can write much more broadly, and I haven't found that to be the case for me. And I don't think there's like a positive and a negative to either sort of trajectory of how you take your poetry. But I would say, even though my poetry is very sort of internally directed, it also is based entirely on my ability to sort of like observe the world around me. That's a great question, actually. I would say, to a certain extent, this is like a little bit unfortunate, but read it like you would like a reading assignment in school. Like give yourself like the cleanliness of your mental state to really engage with it. So, yeah, I don't know, like I try to read, if I'm reading a poetry collection, because poetry collections are also like fairly slim, is to try to read it all in one sitting, or to, if you're not going to read it all in one sitting, to read it broken up and then go back and read it all in one sitting. I think also, like, I'm subscribed to all the like poem a day kind of stuff, which I think is so lovely and so valuable, and I'm so glad that it exists. But I also think sometimes I don't read them when I get them. I'll go back and again read them with like that kind of intention. But yeah, I've done a little bit of like, what is even the word? Like, I haven't really studied literature in like an academic sense, so I don't have anything in terms of like, the additional practice of reading, of like close reading and like distilling meaning and that kind of thing. But I think, like I said, to a certain extent, it's just having like the presence of mind to read with intention and like be really accountable to yourself that you're not distracted and doing other things as you're like trying to absorb the artwork. Yes, so it's called Untitled, which is not very helpful by, and I'm not totally sure of how to pronounce half of her last name, or their last name rather, Tatiana Lubovsky Acosta. And the poem I actually got in Poem a Day and read one of my like reading poetry this morning. And I loved their poem because it was really moving and beautiful. Sort of they describe it as an elegy to their father, but also incredibly funny. And I've never written funny poetry, and like I think it can sometimes like go into the like genre of slapstick, which I don't find all that appealing. But this was just, it was very wry, it was very very forgiving, but also very cutting at the same time. So this poem, the first time I read it, I was like, wow, what an example of an astonishing piece of work. So that is my recommendation. I will give a shout out to Mag 2020, actually, which is a little magazine. I'm interviewing the editor-in-chief that will come, and the interview will come out in the Women on Writing newsletter. And I just think that the editor-in-chief is Sophia Aguilar. I think I think that's her last name. Hang on, sorry, let me double check. I think her work is really exemplary. I really enjoy what she has been doing. She is in her early 20s. She runs a magazine for people publishing in their early 20s and does a lot of other stuff in the writing community. Anyway, I'm really shouting her out, but I'm excited to be interviewing her. And I think Women on Writing is a great resource also for people who are looking for, I think they have Samjoko as a magazine that they tell people to submit to. So, yes, anyway, I don't have anything immediately coming out in the near future, but I am excited to, again, at some time this year.